the same time, I don't know, after like this new theory. About what we talk about.
The overwhelming privileging of democracy as process needs to be left behind. The fetishization of openness, horizontality, and inclusion of much of today's radical left set the stage for ineffectiveness. Secrecy, verticality, and exclusion all have their place as well in effective political action. Democracy cannot be defined simply by its means, not via voting, discussion, or general assemblies. Real democracy must be defined by its goal, collective self-mastery. This is a project which must align politics with the legacy of the Enlightenment to the extent that it is only through harnessing our ability to understand ourselves and our world better that we can come to rule ourselves. We need to posit a collectively controlled, legitimate vertical authority, in addition to distributed horizontal forms of sociality, to avoid becoming the slaves of either a tyrannical, totalitarian centralism or a capricious emergent order beyond our control. The command of the plan must be married to the improvised order of the network. The command of the plan must be married to the improvised order of the network. In fact, the word democracy concerns what I shall call authoritarian opinion. It is forbidden, as it were, not to be a democrat. More precisely, it stands to reason that humanity aspires to democracy, and any subjectivity suspected of not being democratic is regarded as pathological. At best, it refers to a patient re-education. At worst, to the right of military intervention by democratic paratroopers.
Neither the pre-critical relation of the mind as blank and the world as data, nor the mind structuring the blank world, but a double blank.
Under democracy, we are all formally free to run for political leadership, but without the financial and social resources to run a campaign, this is a meaningless freedom. We are all formally free not to take a job, but most of us are nevertheless forced into accepting whatever is on offer. freedom and power are intertwined.
Judging that P is committing oneself to integrating P with what one is already committed to, synthesizing a new constellation of commitments that exhibits the rational unity characteristic of apperception. That extrusion or expulsion of incompatible commitments and extraction of and expansion according to consequential commitments is an inhalation and an exhalation, the breathing rhythm by which a rational subject lives and develops. Hundreds of thousands protest austerity, but unprecedented budget cuts continue. Repeated student protests, occupations, and riots struggle against rises in tuition fees. Around the world, people set up protest camps and mobilize against economic inequality, but the gap between the rich and the poor keeps growing. Failure permeates this cycle of struggles, and as a result, many of the tactics on the contemporary left have taken on a ritualistic nature.
Markets are not natural. Change the laws. Laws are not natural. Change nature. It registers only in the mind of their participants. Millions march. It goes ahead as planned. Failure permeates the cycle of struggles. We must move from cycles to periods, from periods to dash. We are more concerned to appear right rather than to think about the conditions of political change, action at the expense of thought, comforted that they were doing something rather than nothing. Small successes, useful, no doubt, for instilling a sense of hope, nevertheless wither in the face of overwhelming losses. These are survival mechanisms, not a desirable vision for the future. Race, gender, family. Separate logics of domination, yet they indirectly support the world economy.
The dominant tactics, protesting, marching, occupying, and various other forms of direct action, have become a part of a well-established narrative. With the people and the police each playing their assigned roles. This is politics transmuted into pastime. Politics as drug experience, perhaps, rather than anything capable of transforming society. Such protests are registered only in the minds of their participants, bypassing any transformation of social structures. The emphasis on the affective aspects of protests plays into a broader trend that has come to privilege the affective as a site of real politics. Bodily, emotional, and visceral elements come to replace and stymie rather than complement and enhance more abstract analysis. We are more concerned to appear right than to think about the conditions of political change. If politics without passion leads to cold-hearted, bureaucratic technocracy, then passion bereft of analysis
You will never meet the economy in person.
A human being can learn Go after playing just a few times, but for an ML system to do the same, it requires data from hundreds of thousands to millions of games. AlphaGo is trained on over 30 million games of Go, whereas Lee Sedol has likely played only 50,000 games in his lifetime. Machine learning requires an excessive amount of data to do just one thing. Human beings are able to build rich causal models, make strong generalizations, and construct powerful abstractions, all based on extremely limited data. The capacity to generalize based on just a few examples may be at the core of general intelligence.
To conceive of the big and the small as disjoint and not as inseparable, and thus to contradict vision. There is here a patent contradiction between seeing and conceiving, voir et concevoir.
Like if you click on the network, it goes. What was the sentence again? the sentence was, so leisure beyond consumption, collective equipment for a green future.
Collective equipment for
It's a
green
bit,
future.
I mean, I think the subtitle's a bit wordy, but I think leisure beyond consumption is a good phrase. And where like this is, how did the thinking start about this again? How did you like, this is because,
This is basically because we've had a bit of the more intelligent pushback we've had on the 4-day week was how are you going to make sure that people aren't going to just be consuming the shit out of their weekends.
yeah. This is your like flight to Barcelona.
This is my flight to Barcelona thing, blah blah blah. So we need to
And make something concrete about transforming leisure, not just transforming work or the working time that we.
I mean, which is mainly an infrastructural environmental problem, as in, and you can take it on a national scale. You can say, let's make trains free on the weekends to make sure people stay in the UK and go out and see, blah, blah, blah.
Don't use
They
their
hike,
cars.
don't use their cars, whatever. But also let's have saunas in the basements of our new builds and blah, 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 blah.
And equally, we're talking about, like, for example, standard issue bikes, things like that, which is picking up on a theme from, like, even from some of the discourse in the 80s of talking about how do you not just re-pedestrianize cities, but also how do you basically make the bike the kind of standard mode of transport for urban and non-urban spaces as well.
I mean, and that goes into like circular economy.
Yeah.
Because they talk about it here, these climate KSC people, they're into circular economy stuff. I mean, you know, subscription-based consumption.
Yes, precisely. Yeah.
And that's where decarbonizing consumption could come in.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Exactly. Well, that's the whole point of the circular economy stuff, right? Is to reduce waste and sort of that. I mean, I think the reason, but like we were definitely thinking it from an infrastructural basis was what you were talking about, right? It's like it's not just shifting, it's not just nudging people in a kind of like individual consumer way, but in a way of creating a whole different environment within which people navigate the world, and broadly one which like nudges on a large scale, as it were, right? The whole point is that it's not like we don't want it to be just lifestyle choices. This is just.
But it's not just lifestyle choices. It's actually you're changing the scale. I mean, the scalar logic of consumption. So you're having a collective logic of consumption instead of an individual-based
Precisely.
logic one. So you'll have groups of people subscribing to things. You'll have different kinds of contracts with companies, which have to think on a collective basis at different scales rather than on an individual one. So in a way,
and that comes down to things like diet, as it comes down to like either kind of food available, the kind of transport available, as you're just saying, stuff which is like it's universal or quasi-universal in its scope of the level of change that can be made, rather than just like using price as a way of I think this is a project which we definitely this is the Rossio, this is our main one. Do you reckon we should have 5 and there are different levels of scale?
3 or
4, but like different levels. Do you think they should all be like fairly like? Because she sounded like she wanted us to be ambitious, right?
I mean, this is really ambitious because we can throw in aging populations into this. We can throw, I don't know, it can get quite wide because we're talking about everything which is not work, I guess.
Yes, or not like
So
paid
we can-
employment, right?
Well, not employment, so like we can even go into talking about domestic labor. I don't know. Maybe it could get too wide, but
I mean, so they're into climate. They got their real crisis is the climate thing. They're not necessarily like, what about other crises coming? Or maybe, but this is the thing we could exploit. Maybe is the thing is that like we're like, okay, look, this is a thing which is speaks to the climate thing, but also it ties in an aging population as so they're like, oh, like as if it's more like a blind spot for them, but we're like we're also
like this is actually intersectional.
yes, exactly. Which it might make them feel like good. They're ticking that box as well, maybe because they're like, oh, we're also
we also have a portfolio approach.
yes, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So I get no. Here's exactly the way we do it. by 2025, certain percent of the population is going to be over this age. They're not going to be in employment. Therefore, they're going to be in what's now counted as leisure. But it's going to be something quite different. It's going to be, that kind of time is different.
Yeah.
So that's
Which is why your grandmother is a revolutionary subject.
This is why your grandmother is the revolutionary subject. I like it. We finally got that phrase in. No. The better way of phrasing it, the revolutionary subject is your grandma. That's the better way of saying it. Okay, so yeah, I think okay. So do you reckon we should? Because sometimes when people, one way of framing projects is to have like the biggest possible one, and then you can say there's also. So there's one way of going about this would be, or you know what I mean, like one
Whether put this all within that framework.
So we either say like we have age-real consumption because or I don't know which one's the broader one, the one with the Asian population or the one without, where it's just like I do think the Asian population is a good one though.
I think it's a good one. We can just say after work. On a time scale, on a day scale, on like 2 scales of time. The day and the week and the lifetime. Somehow those infrastructures actually are the same in terms, like to the city, it's the same.
And they have to talk to each other because this is the reality of this is like out of all the predictions of the future, the aging population one's the one that's almost certainly going to happen. Well, it's the most surefire one, right? It's not even about automation. It's not even about digitization, things like that. It's actually just like people are going to get older. This is just, I mean, where was I? Aging. Yeah. I'm just trying to find the thing. What was it like? Oh yeah, within 50 years' time, there's going to be an additional 8.6 million people aged over 65, which is roughly the size of London. So it's another London in the UK. An additional London, which is insane. This is ONS. This is not like some cranky.
I know. That was last year, not that they put out all that data on aging. Yes, then we need
Look at that diagram. It's like the big fat schlong.
Yeah. This is men and women, isn't it?
Yeah, of like that with that age. It's like it's like the bulging.
A chance meeting with a Swiss businessman in 1945 gave Hayek the financial means to put his ideas into action. Thus was born the Mark Moran Society, MPS, a closed intellectual network that provided the basic ideological infrastructure for neoliberalism to ferment. It is no exaggeration to say that almost all of the important figures in the post-war creation of neoliberalism were in attendance at its first meeting in 1947, including the Austrian economists, the UK liberals, the Chicago School, the German Ordo Liberals, and a French contingent. From its beginnings, the MPS was consciously focused on changing political common sense and sought to develop a liberal utopia. It explicitly understood that this intellectual framework would then be actively filtered down through think tanks, universities, and policy documents in order to institutionalize and eventually monopolize the ideological terrain. In a letter to those he had invited, Hayek wrote that the purpose of the MPS was to enlist the support of the best minds in formulating a program which has a chance of gaining general support. Our effort therefore differs from any political task, in that it must be essentially a long-run effort, concerned not so much with what would be immediately practicable. The Society thus made a commitment to a long-run war of position in the battle of ideas. Opening the 10-day event, Hayek diagnosed a problem of the new liberals, the lack of alternatives to the existing Keynesian order. There was no consistent philosophy of the opposition groups and no real program for change. As a result of this diagnosis, Hayek defined the central goal of the MPS as changing elite opinion in order to establish the parameters within which public opinion could then be formed. Contrary to a common assumption, capitalists did not initially see neoliberalism as being in their interests. The major task of the MPS was therefore to educate capitalists as to why they should become neoliberals. In order to achieve these goals, the vision of effective action was one of operating on the invisible framework of political common sense that was formed by the ideas circulating in elite networks. From its origins, the MPS eschewed folk politics by working with a global horizon, by working abstractly outside the parameters of existing possibilities, and by formulating a clear strategic conception of the terrain to be occupied, namely elite opinion, in order to change political common sense. Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. That, I believe, is our basic function: to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable. The crisis, stagflation, was one that no government knew how to deal with at the time, while the solution was the preconceived neoliberal ideas that had been fermenting for decades in its ideological ecology. It was not that neoliberals presented a better argument for their position, the myth of rational political discourse. Rather, an institutional infrastructure was constructed to project their ideas and establish them as the new common sense of the political elite. In all of this, there are important lessons to be learned, which have led some to call for a Mont Pelerin of the left. On the broadest level, this history of neoliberalism serves to demonstrate that the greatest recent success of the right, installing a neoliberal hegemony on a global scale, was accomplished through non-folk political means. This means, in the first place, that the neoliberals sought in long-term visions. This was a different temporality from both election cycles and the boom and bust of individual protests. Instead, what the left can learn from is how the MPS patiently set out explicit objectives and analyzed the terrain of their historical conjunction, all in order to propose specific and effective means to alter that terrain. It set its sight on long-term change, waiting 40 years for the crisis of Keynesianism and the emergence of Reagan and Thatcher. In taking this approach, the intellectuals of neoliberalism thought abstractly in terms of possibilities. What was impossible during their own time became possible later, partly through their actions and preparations. Secondly, they sought to build a counter-hegemonic project that would overturn the consensus around social democracy and Keynesian policies. They took a full-spectrum approach to changing hegemonic conditions and built up an entire ideological infrastructure that was capable of insinuating itself into every political issue and every fiber of political common sense. It overthrew the hegemonic ideas of its time. The third major lesson for the left to learn is that the loose collective of MPS also thought expansively in spatial terms, aiming to spread the network globally through key nodes. In the think tank, they found an organizational form adapted to the task of global intellectual hegemony. They established networks between think tanks, politicians, journalists, the media, and teachers, building a consistency between these disparate groups that did not require a unity of purpose or organizational form. This entailed an admirable flexibility in their project. While neoliberalism is often denounced as being too empirically disparate to make sense as a coherent project, it is in fact the willingness to modify its ideas in light of conditions on the ground that has made it particularly powerful as an ideology. Under democracy, we are all formally free to run for political leadership, but without the financial and social resources to run a campaign, this is a meaningless freedom. We are all formally free not to take a job. but most of us are nevertheless forced into accepting whatever is on offer. Freedom and power are intertwined.
A parrot trained to respond to the visible presence of red things by uttering tokens of rock that's red might share reliable differential dispositions with a genuine observer of red things, but it is functioning at most as a measuring instrument, labeling, not describing, the things it responds to as red. It is only because expressions in terms of which we describe objects locate these objects in a space of implications that they describe at all, rather than merely label. The genuine observer of red things must, as a mere differential responder to red things need not, place it in a space of implications by knowing something about what follows from some things being classified as red, and what would be evidence for or against such a classification being correct. The distinction between humans and intelligent machines are also becoming blurred. When that which at first appeared as the object sinks to the level of being to consciousness a knowledge of the object, and when the in itself becomes a being for consciousness of the in itself, then this is the new object.
Of proximity with the absolute referent is properly affirmative. Its instrumental concept is here not the negation.
A Texan 6-year-old asked an Echo device, "Can you play dollhouse with me and get me a dollhouse?" Being a good servant and personification of the money of this child's parents, Alexa ordered a $160 KidCraft Sparkle Mansion and 4 pounds of sugar cookies, which Amazon quickly delivered to the girl's doorstep. When CW6, a San Diego local TV station, reported on this accidental order, one of the anchors commented, "I love the little girl saying, 'Alexa, order me a dollhouse.'" This triggered Echo devices listening in on the broadcast to again personify money and order more dollhouses. We speculate that the becoming extinct of humans might occur through many narrow AIs carrying out economic functions, in particular buying and selling on our behalf. Alexa, Google Home, IoT-connected fridges, direct debits, business-to-business ordering systems, and more. Connected to AI-run dark factories and logistical systems in which human laborers have mostly become replaced by either narrow or general AI, the human is taken out of the economic loop in favor of a completely automated capital. The human is taken out of the economic loop in favor of a completely automated capital. AI would personify all economic categories, including capital and labor power, commodities, and money. The class struggle would thus continue, but with generally intelligent machines filling up the rank and file and also personifying capital. Consider that capital's foundational process of primitive accumulation, with its large-scale eviction of populations from the land to form urban proletariats, is generally considered to have occurred over centuries rather than decades, and indeed, on a global scale, to still be incomplete. Despite futurist insistence on the speeded-up nature of contemporary social change, one can imagine a capitalist phase of futuristic accumulation, shedding, rather than amassing, wage labor, but in a similarly uneven and protracted fashion. With the emergence of AGI, however, the futuristic accumulation of surplus populations would slowly or quickly engulf the human species. While capital does not care what material its labor powers come in, it cares about the productivity of labor, and AGI would be far more productive than baseline humans. An AGI need not engage in time-consuming superfluous behaviors like breathing and eating. AGI hardware could be endlessly augmented and could, therefore, do whatever humans can do, but with more efficiency and faster. Indeed, an AGI need not be limited to any morphology or even a body at all. Learning how to use new and different bodies for environments with extreme pressure, cold, or heat, it could likely divide its attention between numerous bodies or entities. Indeed, it could exist as a factory or even an entire supply chain.
The more capacity we have to act, the freer we are. One of the biggest indictments of capitalism is that it enables the freedom to act for only a vanishingly small few. A primary aim of a post-capitalist world would therefore be to maximize synthetic freedom, or in other words, to enable the flourishing of all of humanity and the expansion of our collective horizons. Achieving this involves at least 3 different elements: the provision of the basic necessities of life, the expansion of social resources, and the development of technological capacities. Taken together, these form a synthetic freedom that is constructed rather than natural, a collective historical achievement rather than the result of simply leaving people be. Emancipation is thus not about detaching from the world and liberating a free soul, but instead a matter of constructing and cultivating the right attachments. In the first place, synthetic freedom entails the maximal provision of the basic resources needed for a meaningful life. Things like income, time, health, and education.
All swans are white, and all swans are not white, is contrary. All swans are white, and some swans are non-white, is contradictory, as well as all swans are non-white, and some swans are white. Some swans are white is compatible with some swans are non-white.
Most people are left formally, but not rising global inequality is revealed as an equally massive disparity in freedom. In a world of synthetic freedom, high-quality public goods would be provided for us. Beyond the social democratic imagination, however, like 2 further essentials of existence, time and money. Free time is the basic condition for self-determination and the development of our capacities. Equally, synthetic freedom demands the provision of a basic income to all in order for them to be fully free. Such a policy not only provides the monetary resources for living under capitalism, but also makes possible an increase in free time. It provides us with the capacity to choose our lives. We can experiment and build unconventional lives, choosing to foster our cultural, intellectual, and physical sensibilities instead of blindly working to expand our capacities beyond what is currently possible.
Intelligence is akin to the good itself. Mind is introduced as an ingredient, yet it is the cause of the mixture. There is mind as pertaining to the particular, to the species, and there is mind as a principle, the idea of the mind. Mind is responsible for its own being as an object of its own concept. Mind is responsible for its own being as an object of its own concept. The good is not a goal, it's a principle, and mind crafts an object of its own concept. The mind is the only thing, only idea in the universe that is capable of constructing itself as an object of its own concept. And by virtue of this, it is able to attain absolute knowledge itself, and not a knowledge of sensible object. Sensible objects are avatars to the things in themselves. Sensible objects are avatars for the things in themselves. Intelligence is never reduced to physical description. What's at the stake is a form of Socrates, the objective principles, not physical state.
Then can we say that in the programmatic framework, the choice of axioms does not confine the program to the explicit terms of the axioms? Rather, it commits it to their underlying properties and operations specific to their class of complexity. To say it differently, a program constructs the possible realizabilities of the underlying properties of its axioms. It is not essentially restricted to their terms.
Which is to say, A is an E.
Or if the form E, Socrates partially exhibits, defines who Socrates is, A, or if Socrates is a rational life form.
And if A does X equals F for function or activity, then Socrates does something to display particular properties of realm of form. Or Socrates does X as a rational life form.
Then we can say Socrates as a rational life form is a particular pattern uniformity through which implicit patterns or properties specific to the realm of forms can be realized in the temporal order. F, or what Socrates does as a rational life form, is a partial realization of these forms as a practice or operation. In other words, F is a practice whose operational content can be traced, changed, and combined with other practices to construct more complex realizabilities specific to the realm of forms which Socrates partially embodies. In this example, 1 and 2, represent the axiom and its basic operational information that can be abbreviated as this A is F of E form. Socrates' actions reflect the form to which Socrates belongs, or Socrates is what Socrates does as a rational life form.
Yes, names and verbs. But let's take a step back and reorient ourselves. Earlier I said human learns. And that does not seem right.
Not at all, or perhaps it is only true now.
But what is it to say now? We see temporality of past, present, future, but the world is not like that. It's a transcendental ideal. The immediacy is illusory. Where there is no temporality, there is no earlier than. Where there is no temporality, there is no earlier than or later than. The immediacy is illusory. There is only time as eternity. There is only time as eternity. When there is a match between the universe and our experience, we should be suspicious. Sequential coordination is not temporal. The change is not temporal. It's metrical spatial coordination. Just because something precedes something else, it does not mean it temporally precedes it. It's only from perspective of time, from an agential perspective, which is not metaphysical or ontological, but pragmatic. The reality of time is timeless.
If it is to avoid the problem of manipulating people into contentment with the status quo, synthetic freedom must be open to whatever people might desire. Processes of social reasoning, for instance, can enable common understanding. Language is effectively cognitive scaffolding that enables us to leverage powers to act than individuals alone. The development, deepening, and expansion of knowledge enable us to imagine and achieve capacities that are otherwise unattainable. As we acquire technical knowledge of our built environment and scientific knowledge of the natural world, and come to understand the fluid tendencies of the social world, just as knowledge of the laws of light has never prevented men from seeing, so knowledge of the laws that govern the development of societies does not prevent men from living. Knowledge of the laws of light has produced the glasses which have transformed men's sight. Configuration of the material world in accordance with the drive to expand our capacities for action. It demands experimentation with collective and technological augmentation, and a spirit that refuses to accept any barrier as natural and inevitable. Cyborg augmentations, artificial life, synthetic biology, and technologically mediated reproduction are all examples of this collaboration. The overall aim must therefore be picked out as an unrelenting project to unbind the necessities of this world and transform them into materials for the further construction of freedom. Such an image of emancipation can never be satisfied with or condensed into a static society, but will instead continually strain beyond any limitations. Freedom is a synthetic enterprise, not a natural gift. Underlying this idea of emancipation is a vision of humanity as a transformative and constructible hypothesis, one that is built through theoretical and practical experimentation and elaboration. There is no authentic human essence to be realized, no harmonious unity to be returned to, no unalienated humanity obscured by false mediations, no organic wholeness to be achieved. Alienation is a mode of enablement, and humanity is an incomplete vector of transformation. What we are and what we can become are open-ended projects to be constructed in the course of time. Correct the youth, teach the child. Concept having intelligence to a low degree. It is only through undergoing the process of revision and construction that humanity can come to know itself. This means revising the human both theoretically and practically, engaging in new modes of being and new forms of sociality as practical ramifications of making the human explicit. It is to undertake an interventionist approach to the human that is opposed to those humanisms that protect a parochial image of the human at all costs. These interventions range from individual bodily experimentation to collective political mobilizations against restricted images of the human and everything in between. It means liberating ourselves from the decrepit economic image of humanity that capitalist modernity has installed and inventing a new humanity. Emancipation under this vision would therefore mean increasing the capacity of humanity to act according to whatever its desires might become, and universal emancipation would be the insistent and maximal extension of this goal to the entirety of our species. It is in this sense that universal emancipation lies at the heart of a modern left. Rather than a Eurocentric view of the future, it would rely upon a global set of voices articulating and negotiating in practice what a common and plural future might be. Whether operating through slave revolts, worker struggles, anti-colonial uprisings, or women's movements, the critics of sedimented universalisms have always been essential agents in modernity's construction of the future. They are the ones who have continually revised, revolted, and created a universalism from below. Yet, to truly enable the liberation of futures in the plural, the current global order, premised on wage labor and capitalist accumulation, will need to be transcended first. A left modernity will, in other words, require building a post-capitalist and post-work platform upon which multiple ways of living could emerge and flourish. What does it mean to call for the end of work? By work we mean our jobs, or wage labor, the time and effort we sell to someone else in return for an income. The post-work world is therefore not a world of idleness, rather, it is a world in which people are no longer bound to their jobs, but free to create their own lives. Rapid automation, expanding surplus populations, and the continued imposition of austerity all heighten the need to rethink work and prepare for the new crises of capitalism. Just as the Mont-Pelerin Society foreshadowed the crisis of Keynesianism and prepared a full-spectrum set of responses, so too should the left prepare for the coming crisis of working surplus populations, even as automation promises to toss more and more workers aside. In the face of these tensions, the political project for the 21st century left must be to build an economy in which people are no longer dependent upon wage labor for survival, opposing the expulsion of surplus populations and attacking the mechanisms of control over them. Mass incarceration and the racialized system of domination associated with it must be abolished, and the spatial mechanisms of control, ranging from ghettos to border controls, must be taken apart to ensure the free movement of peoples. Our first demand is for a fully automated economy. Using the latest technological developments, such an economy would aim to liberate humanity from the drudgery of work while simultaneously producing increasing amounts of wealth. Machines can increasingly produce all necessary goods and services while also releasing humanity from the effort of producing them. We argue that the tendencies towards automation and the replacement of human labor should be enthusiastically accelerated and targeted as a political project of the left. This is a project that takes an existing capitalist tendency and seeks to push it beyond the acceptable parameters of capitalist social relations. Workers who move symbols on a screen are as at risk as those moving goods around a warehouse. Full automation is something that can and should be carried out, and this reiterates the importance of making full automation a political demand rather than assuming it will come about from economic necessity. A variety of policies can help in this project. More state investment, higher minimum wage, and research devoted to technologies that replace rather than augment workers. Despite the efficiency, accuracy, and productivity of machine labor, capitalism prefers to make profits and therefore uses human labor whenever it is cheaper than capital investment. We are all formally free not to take a job. Not only the myth of the given, but the myth of the taken.
AI will outperform humans in translating languages by 2024, driving a truck by 2027, working retail by 2031, and writing a best-selling book by 2049. There is a 30% chance of AI outperforming humans in all of these tasks in 45 years, and all human jobs will be automated in 120 years.
Our disbelief in Parmenides have gotten even farther than his prohibition. We've pushed our investigation ahead and shown him something more than what he prohibited.
I guess the idea is that
Never shall we force it.
automating construction
That which is not may be. Keep your thought
possibly
far
best
beyond this
done
path
with
of
something
search.
like Legos.
But we've not only
instead of,
shown
say,
that those which are not
3D
are.
printing
But we've also caused what turns out to be form of which is not.
They sort of have,
We've also
they are
shown that the
discrete
nature of
bits,
different
and they lock into each
is
other.
chopped up among
You
all
know,
other
it's
beings
it's the same
in relation to
law-
itself. Then we dare to say that which
law
is
of
not
logic we all know
is just
from,
namely this. It's the nature of the part of the
from toys.
different set to over against that which
They go
is.
up, down,
Sense.
slide into each other. It's pretty simple.
Nobody can say
but the
this,
idea is that
which is
they
not,
are
which
inherently
we've made to appear,
di-
and now we dare to
digital,
say is the contrary of that which is.
because they have a logic of male and
And the
female,
contrary of that which
like a
is,
0 and 1.
whether it is or not, or whether or not an account can be given of it.
I'm gonna have
And
to
with
think about
regards
this
to
for
the
just
which
a
is
second.
not, which we've said is, let someone refute or persuade us and say that we've made a mistake, or else, if he cannot do that, then he has to say what we say. He has to say that the kinds blend with each other, and which is in a different pervades all of them in each other, and that the different shares in that which is, and so because of that sharing is. But he will not say that it is in which it shares in, but it's different from it.
And yeah, the idea is that robots are going to understand this logic much better than traditional construction, and that the reason it's so hard to automate it is because we haven't sort of
Each of them, or all
fully
the others,
bent architecture to
itself.
a digital.
Then which is
way of thinking.
indisputably is not a million of things, or all the others. And each of them
I'll
are
send you
in
some of
many
the
ways and are
some of
not
the images
in
as
many
well.
ways.
And if someone doesn't believe it's
Maybe
contrary,
you
then
could-
they have to think about it themselves and come up with something better than what we've said. But if they think they've recognized
They were
the
built
problem and they enjoy
not with
dragging the
robots,
argument back and
very-
forth, that's
very
not
much
what's
by
drawing
hand.
one's attention. Go by what we've been saying.
But that's also
That sort of
part of
thing
the
isn't
concept is
clever
that you can
or
actually,
hard to discover,
because
but
the
this
most
other
important thing
is both
is
difficult and at
the
the same
shape.
time beautiful.
What other things?
It doesn't really
That we
matter
said
how
earlier.
it's built, what material it's made of.
That is,
You can, as long as you can sort
we
of
should be
snap
able to
onto the
follow
next
what a
piece,
person says
you can keep
step
making
by
it
step
more
and
ways,
scrutinize
more
it.
efficiently, more and more.
When they say that the same
It's
is
just
different in a
dictated
certain way, or that the different is
et
the
cetera,
same in a
so it
certain
sort of
way, we should
embodies
understand
this
just what way
idea
they mean.
of sort
and
of
the
high
precise
resolution
respect
collective
that a thing
resource.
is the same or different.
So let's say if once upon a time
But
we
if they
had
make the same appear different in just any
social
old way, or they
housing,
make
let's say,
what's large appear
understood
small,
as
or something
a
that's similar appear dissimilar.
collection of discrete living
If they
units,
enjoy
the
trotting out
discrete
contraries
element,
like that in
and this
discussion. That's
system
not true
becomes
refutation.
the actual brick. You could
That's just
actually
the
log
obvious
this
newborn
onto
brainchild
a
of someone who's
digital
first come
system.
into
This could have
contact with
its
those which are.
unique
Definitely. It is
ID.
not to separate everything from everything
and
else.
it could
It's a
recompose
sign of completely
into
unmusical and
into
unphilosophical
anything,
person.
I guess, at this
To dissociate
kind of scale,
everything
and you
from
could have
everything else
them some made of
is to
wood, some
destroy
made
all
of
there is to say.
metal,
And the
some very
weaving
large
of the
ones,
form is what makes
to
speech
fit
possible to us.
p-
That's
pipes, because
Think about what a
these are all
good
the same
moment would
size,
be to
but
fight it
actually,
against people like that,
um,
and to force
the
them
idea is that you
to
could
blend
have
one with
a
another.
brick which
And the
is
speech turns out to be one of the
let's
forms
say
among the others.
proportionally
And if we're
smaller,
deprived
which
of
will
that,
then
then we would be deprived of philosophy.
slide into here,
Attention,
etc., to infinity. The whole idea is that it's digital even if it's built in an analog way, because it's the logic of the piece itself
Yeah, yeah.
is inherently digital.
Is the color for orientation or is it for?
I guess there was a sort of, I really wanted to make it a slightly luxury communist brick.
A final limit of full automation is the moral status we give to certain jobs, such as care work. These tasks, including raising of children, are ones that many would argue must be carried out by human beings. We can outline two broad approaches to these sorts of labors. A first approach would agree that such labor has moral value and should be carried out by humans rather than machines. In a post-work society, however, care labor could be given greater value, turning society away from the privileged status bestowed upon profitable labor. The free time that accrues from full automation could also facilitate experimentation with alternative domestic arrangements. There is a long history of utopian experiments that can be drawn upon to rethink how our societies organize domestic, reproductive, and care labor. All of this, it must be stressed, would still require a political movement to achieve. A post-work world may facilitate change, but it cannot guarantee it. A more radical approach, however, argues that automating much of this labor should be a goal for the future. Indeed, the stereotype that women are naturally nurturing and desiring of this affective labor is often a pernicious cover for their continued exploitation. But what if much of this labor could be eliminated? Traditionally, the household has been a space that featured little technological change. Its unpaid nature and lack of productivity norms have given capitalism few incentives to invest in the reduction of household labor. Yet increasingly, domestic tasks, like cleaning the house and folding clothes, for example, can be delegated to machines. Assistive technologies and affective computing are also making inroads in automating some of the highly personal and embarrassing care work that might be better suited to impersonal robots. More speculatively, some have argued that the pain and suffering involved in pregnancy is something that should be relegated to the past, rather than mystified as natural and beautiful. In this vision, synthetic forms of biological reproduction would enable a newfound equality between the sexes. Full automation is a utopian demand that aims to reduce necessary labor as much as possible.
If work has extended itself into so many areas of our lives, a return to a shorter work week would bring with it a number of benefits. Beyond the most obvious, that it increases free time, it would bring with it a series of more subtle benefits. In the first place, reducing the working week constitutes a key response to rising automation. In fact, the role of this policy in previous periods of automation is often forgotten. The primary periods of automation coincided with significant reductions in the working week. Employment was often sustained by redistributing the work. A second benefit of this policy is its various environmental advantages. For instance, reductions in the working week would lead to significant reductions in energy consumption and our overall carbon footprint. A reduction in working hours is therefore an essential plank in any response to climate change. Other research suggests that a shorter working week would bring a general reduction in the stress, anxiety, and mental health problems fostered by neoliberalism. But one of the most important reasons for reducing work time is that it is a demand that both consolidates and generates class power. In the first place, reducing work time can be deployed as a temporary tactic in political struggle. Working to contract, strikes, and other ways of removing labor time are means to exert pressure on capitalists. But secondly, and most importantly, the reduction of the working week also makes the labor movement stronger. By withdrawing labor hours from the market, the total supply of labor goes down and worker power increases. No other bargaining demand simultaneously enhances bargaining position. Furthermore, no other strategic logic initiates a continuous virtuous cycle in which each victory establishes the conditions for strength in the next struggle. For these reasons, the goal of reducing the working week should be an immediate and prominent demand of the 21st century left. Our preference is for the establishment of a 3-day weekend, rather than a reduction in the working day, in order to cut down on commuting and to build upon the long holiday weekends already in existence. This demand can be achieved in a number of ways, through trade union struggles, pressure from social movements, and legislative change by political parties. Conduct both a short game and a long game, superficially appearing to the uninformed to be in mutual conflict, but united behind the scenes by overarching theoretical aims. Markets do not spontaneously emerge as the state packs away, but instead must be consciously constructed, sometimes from the ground up. There is no natural market for water, fresh air, land, healthcare, or education.
One point at money.
Can you point at redness?
That is a red thing that is not redness.
Real abstractions are generated through social practices rather than intellection. It is abstract because you cannot point to it.
You can't hold money in your hand. You can only hold one of its tokens. The demand for a UBI, however, is subject to competing hegemonic forces. It is just as open to being mobilized for a libertarian dystopia as for a post-work society, an ambiguity that has led many to mistakenly conflate the two poles. In demanding a UBI, therefore, 3 key factors must be articulated in order to make it meaningful. It must provide a sufficient amount of income to live on, it must be universal, provided to everyone unconditionally, and it must be a supplement to the welfare state rather than a replacement of it. The first point is obvious enough. The UBI must provide a material adequate income. The exact amount will vary between countries and regions, but it can be relatively easily arrived at with existing data. The risk is that, if set too low, UBI becomes just a government subsidy to businesses. In addition, UBI must be universal and given to everyone unconditionally. As there would be no means testing or other measures required to receive the UBI, it would break free of the disciplinary nature of welfare capitalism. Moreover, a universal grant avoids the stigmatization of welfare since everyone receives it. The invocation of universalism also obliges the continual subversion of any restricted application of a basic income, in terms of individual statuses, citizens, immigrants, or prisoners. The demand for universality provides the basis for a continued struggle to expand the scope and scale of the basic income. The conservative argument for a basic income, which must be avoided at all costs, is that it should simply replace the welfare state by providing a lump sum of money to every individual. In this scenario, the UBI would just become a vector of increased marketization. There are a vast number of reasons to support a UBI: reduced poverty, better public health and reduced health costs, fewer high school dropouts, reductions in petty crime, more time with family and friends, and less state bureaucracy. Depending on how UBI is presented, it is capable of generating support from across the political spectrum, from libertarians, conservatives, anarchists, Marxists, and feminists, among others. The potency of the demand lies partly in this ambiguity, making it capable of mobilizing broad popular support. However, for our purposes, the significance of UBI as a demand lies in 4 key interrelated factors. It is often thought that UBI is simply a form of redistribution from the rich to the poor, or that it is just a measure to maintain economic growth by stimulating consumer demand. From this perspective, UBI would have impeccable reformist credentials and be little more than a glorified progressive tax system. Yet the real significance of UBI lies in the way it overturns the asymmetry of power that currently exists between labor and capital. The proletariat is defined by its separation from the means of production and subsistence. The proletariat is thereby forced to sell itself in the job market in order to gain the income necessary to survive. The most fortunate among us have the leisure to choose which job to take, but few of us have the capacity to choose no job. A basic income
There's no
changes
longer
this
any
condition
need to
by
compress
giving the
a myriad
proletariat
of
a means of
heterogeneous
subsistence
facts into
without
the
dependency
straitjacket
on a
of
job.
prices.
Workers,
when
in
computer
other
chips
words,
can communicate
have the
those
option to
facts
choose
directly.
whether to take a job or not.
It is not
In
a
many
question
ways,
of universal
taking
basic
neoclassical
income,
economics
but
at its word
uncountable
and making
basic
work
income.
truly voluntary. The
Purely
UBI
uncountable,
therefore
the
unbinds the
reproductive work
coercive
we do
aspects of
to
wage labor,
reproduce society
partially
as it is.
decommodifies labor, and thus transforms the political relationship between labor and capital. This transformation, making work voluntary rather than coerced, has a number of significant consequences. In the first place, it increases class power by reducing slack in the labor market. Surplus populations show what happens when there are large amounts of slack in the labor market. Wages fall and employers are free to debase workers. By contrast, when the labor market is tight, labor gains its political edge. If every worker were employed, the threat of being fired would lose its disciplinary character. There would be more than enough jobs waiting just outside. Workers would gain the upper hand and capital would lose its political power. The same dynamic holds for a basic income. By eliminating the reliance on wage labor, workers gain control over how much labor to supply, giving them significant power in the labor market. Class power is also increased in a variety of other ways. Strikes are easier to mobilize since workers no longer have to worry about pay being docked or dwindling strike funds. The amount of time spent working for a wage can be modified to one's own desire, with free time spent building communities and engaging with politics. One can slow down and reflect, safely protected from the constant pressures of neoliberalism. The anxieties that surround work and unemployment are reduced with the safety net of a UBI. Moreover, the demand for UBI combines the needs of the employed, the unemployed, the underemployed, migrant labor, temporary workers, students, and the disabled. It articulates a common interest between these groups and provides a populist orientation for them to mobilize towards. The second related feature of UBI is that it transforms precarity and unemployment from a state of insecurity to a state of voluntary flexibility. It is often forgotten that the initial push for flexible labor came from workers, as a way of demolishing the constraining permanency of traditional forced labor. The repetitiveness of a 9-to-5 job, combined with the tediousness of most work, is hardly an appealing prospect for a lifelong career. The demands of care labor often require a flexible approach as well, further undermining the appeal of traditional jobs. Marx himself invokes the liberating aspects of flexible labor in his famous claim that communism makes it possible for me to do one thing today and another tomorrow. Communism makes it possible for me to do one thing today and another tomorrow, to hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner, just as I have a mind, without ever becoming hunter, fisherman, herdsman, or critic. In the face of these desires for flexibility, capital adopted and co-opted them into a new form of exploitation. Today, flexible labor simply presents itself as precarity and insecurity rather than freedom.
Point to your family.
The UBI
Emancipation
responds to
is
this
not
generalization
about
of
detaching
precarity
from the
and
world
transforms it
and
from a
liberating
state to
free
be
soul,
feared back
but
into a
instead
state of
a matter
liberation.
of constructing and cultivating
Third,
the right
a basic
attachments.
income would necessitate a rethinking of the values attributed to different types of work. Given that workers would no longer be forced out of a job, they could instead simply reject jobs that need contribute to the production of reproductive capital, offer too few our activity deserves to be rethinking as well. Low-wage recognizing often press, the UBI indicates that under a program of UBI, it is unlikely that many would want to undertake it. The result all the genetic, historical, and social variations that make have to be better paid, while more are rewarding, invigorating, and attractive people are valued less simply for being people. In other words, finally, the nature of the basic income is a fundamentally feminist, not merely its disregard for the gender. The outcome of this revaluation would also biases as wages for the worst jobs predicated upon. There would be new incentives to automate them. It recognizes their contributions as unwaged domestic demand for cultivation. On the other hand, a basic income would not only transform the value of the worst jobs, but also go some way towards recognizing the unpaid labor of most care work. In the same way that the demand for wages for housework recognized and politicized the domestic labor of women, so too does UBI recognize and politicize the generalized way in which we are all responsible for reproducing society. From informal to formal work, from domestic to public work, from individual to collective. What is central is not productive labor, defined in either traditional Marxist or neoclassical terms, but rather the more general category of reproductive labor. The financial independence that comes with the basic income is also crucial to developing the synthetic freedom of women. It enables experimentation with different forms of family and community structure that are no longer bound to the model of the privatized nuclear family. And financial independence can reconfigure intimate relationships as well. One of the more unexpected findings of experiments with UBI has been that the divorce rate tended to rise. Conservative commentators jumped on this as proof of the demands of morality, but higher divorce rates are easily explained as women gaining the financial means to leave dysfunctional relationships. A basic income can therefore enable easier experimentation with the family structure, more possibilities for the provision of childcare, and an easier transformation of the gender division of labor. Moreover, unlike the demand for wages for housework in the 1970s, the demand for UBI promises to break out of the wage relation rather than reinforce it. While a universal basic income may appear economically reformist, its political implications are therefore significant. It transforms precarity, it recognizes social labor, it makes class power easier to mobilize, and it extends the space in which to experiment with how we organize communities and families. It is a redistribution mechanism that transforms production relations. It is an economic mechanism that changes the politics of work. And in terms of class struggle, there is little to distinguish full employment from full unemployment. Both tighten the labor market, give power to labor, and make it more difficult to exploit workers. Full unemployment has the added advantages of not being reliant upon the gender division of labor between the household and the formal economy, of not keeping workers chained to the wage relation, and of allowing workers autonomy over their lives. For all of these reasons, the classic social democratic demand for full employment should be replaced with the future-oriented demand for full unemployment.
We are obliged to see the world through rational eyes, not only because the world then looks rationally back, but because that rational world is the only mirror in which we can see ourselves.
Do we dare to utter the sound that which in no way is?
Of course.
What should the name that which is not be applied to?
That seems impossible to answer.
That which is not can't be applied to those which are.
Of course not.
And if you can't apply them to those which are, it's not right to apply it to something.
Why not?
If something is a sign of one, a couple things is a sign of two, and some things is a sign of plurality, how do you express that which is or that which is not apart from number? That which is not should not share in either one or in plurality, and yet we speak of it as one by saying that which is not. By attaching that which to it, we speak of it as one. Try saying something correct about that which is not, without attaching either being, one, or numerical plurality to it. Well, then what if we admit that everything has the capacity to associate with everything else?
I can solve that one.
How?
Because if change and rest belong to each other, then change would be completely at rest, and conversely, rest itself would be changing.
And I suppose that's ruled out by the strict necessity that change should be at rest, and rest should change.
Of course.
So the third option is the only one left.
Yes.
Certainly one of the three has to be the case. Either everything is willing to blend with everything else, or nothing is, or some things are and some are not.
Of course.
And we found the first two options were impossible.
Yes.
The sophist runs off into the darkness of that which is not, which they've had practice dealing with, and they're hard to see because the place is so dark.
It seems to be.
But the philosopher always uses reasoning to stay near the form, being. The philosopher isn't easy to see because the area is so bright. We can think of the philosopher more clearly later on if we want to, but we have to get a good look at the sophist.
But let's not talk about every form.
That way we won't be thrown off by dealing with too many of them.
Exactly.
The most important kinds we've just been discussing are that which is, change, and rest.
Yes, by far.
And the two don't blend.
Definitely not.
But both of them share in that which is, since presumably both of them are.
Yes.
There's three. Each is different from two, but the same as itself.
Yes.
But what is the same and the different that we've just been discussing? Are they two kinds of other than those three, but necessarily always sharing with them? And do we have to think of it as five and not three? Or have what we've been calling the same and the different turned out to be among those three without our realizing it?
Maybe.
But change and rest can't be the same or the different.
Why not?
Whatever change and rest are in common can't be either one of them.
Why not?
Then change would rest and rest would change. In both cases, if either change or rest came to be the same or different, it would force the other to the contrary of its own nature, since it would share in its contrary.
I suppose.
Both do share in the same and the different.
Yes.
So anyway, let's not say that change is the same or the different, nor that rest is.
Okay.
But do we have to think of the same and that which is as being one?
Maybe.
But if the same and that which is aren't completely distinct, then when we say that change and rest both are, we'll be labeling both of them as being the same.
But that's impossible.
So it's impossible for the same and that which is to be one.
Yes.
The same is fourth in addition to the three forms.
And the fifth is the different.
Work has become central to our very self-conception, so much so that when presented with the idea of doing less work, many people ask, but what would I do? The fact that so many people find it impossible to imagine a meaningful life outside of work demonstrates the extent to which the work ethic has infected our minds. While typically associated with the Protestant work ethic, the submission to work is in fact implicit in many religions. These ethics demand dedication to one's work regardless of the nature of the job, instilling a moral imperative that drudgery should be valued. More contemporary forms of this imperative have taken on a liberal humanist character, portraying work as a central means of self-expression. Work has come to be driven into our identity, portrayed as the only means for true self-fulfillment. In the absence of clear metrics for productivity, workers instead put on performances of productivity.
pretending to enjoy their job, or smiling while being yelled at by a customer. Working long hours has become a sign of devotion to the job, even as it perpetuates the gender pay gap. With work tied so tightly into our identities, overcoming the work ethic will require us overcoming ourselves. With work tied so tightly into our identities, identity becomes something implicit that we work to make explicit all the time. Persons insist on their nation or identity or body in search of their surplus value, seeking some uniqueness, which ultimately amounts to simply making their nation or identity or body saleable on the global market. The central ideological support for the work ethic is that remuneration be tied to suffering. Everywhere one looks, there is a drive to make people suffer before they can receive a reward. The epithets thrown at homeless beggars, the demonization of those on the dole, the labyrinthine system of bureaucracy set up to receive benefits, the unpaid job experience imposed upon the unemployed, the sadistic penalization of those who are seen as getting something for free, all reveal the truth that for our societies, remuneration requires work and suffering. Whether for a religious or secular goal, suffering is thought to constitute a necessary rite of passage. People must endure through work before they can receive wages. They must prove their worthiness before the eyes of capital. This thinking has an obvious theological basis, where suffering is thought to be not only meaningful, but in fact the very condition of meaning. A life without suffering is seen as frivolous and meaningless. This position must be rejected as a holdover from a now transcended stage of human history. The drive to make suffering meaningful may have had some functional logic in times when poverty, illness, and starvation were necessary features of existence. But we should reject this logic today and recognize that we have moved beyond the need to ground meaning in suffering. Work and the suffering that accompanies it should not be glorified. Capitalism demands that people work in order to make a living, yet it is increasingly unable to generate enough jobs. The tensions between the value accorded to the work ethic and these material changes will only heighten the potential for transformation of the system. Actions to make precarity and joblessness an increasingly visible political problem would go some way to generating the support for a post-work society.
The genuine philosophers who haunt our cities, by contrast to the fake ones, take on all different types of appearances.
The shift to a post-work society, much like the shift to a decarbonized economy, is not just a matter of overcoming a few elite interests.
The genuine philosophers who haunt our cities, by contrast to the fake ones, take on all sorts of different appearances, just because of other people's ignorance. As philosophers look down from above at the lives of those below them, some people think they're worthless, and others think they are worth everything in the world. Sometimes they take on the appearance of statesmen, and sometimes as sophists.
More fundamentally, it is a matter of transforming society from the ground up. An engagement with the totality of power and capital is inevitable. We must first reach a space within which more radical demands can be meaningfully articulated, and must therefore prepare for the long term if we wish to alter the terrain of politics substantially. Capitalism did not emerge all at once, but instead percolated to a position of dominance over the course of centuries. A large number of components had to be put in place: landless laborers, widespread commodity production, private property, technical sophistication, centralization of wealth, a bourgeois class, a work ethic, and so on. These historical conditions are the components that enabled the systemic logic of capitalism eventually to gain traction in the world. The lesson here is that, just as capitalism relied upon the accumulation of a particular set of components, so too will post-capitalism. It will neither emerge all at once nor in the wake of some revolutionary moment. The task of the left must be to work out the conditions for post-capitalism and to struggle to build them on a continually expanding scale. Any transformative project will take time. We limit our analysis here largely to Western capitalist democracies, with their peculiar apparatuses of political and economic power. We will mostly leave aside the immense and immensely important regions of the rest of the world. However, it is worth reiterating that the problems of automation and surplus populations are global in nature, and the grounds for post-work are flourishing around the world. Equally, it remains insufficient simply to posit that progress will be worked out in practice, or that the masses will spontaneously create a better world. While there are undoubtedly elements of luck and unpredictability in any struggle, the difficulty of building a new world, this is the strategy that is adaptable from positions of weakness, is scalable from the local to the global, and recognizes the hold that capitalism has over every aspect of our lives, from our most intimate desires to the most abstract financial flows. A counter-hegemonic strategy entails a project to overturn the dominant neoliberal common sense and rejuvenate the collective imagination. Fundamentally, it is an attempt to install a new common sense, one organized around the crisis of work and its effects on the proletariat. In this, it involves preparatory work for moments when full-scale struggle erupts, transforming our social imagination and reconfiguring our sense of what is possible. It builds up support and a common language for a new world, seeking to alter the balance of power in preparation for when a crisis upsets the legitimacy of society. Unlike forms of folk politics, such a strategy is expansive, long-term, comfortable with abstraction and complexity, and aimed at overthrowing capitalist universalism. If something is not deemed realistic, then it will not even be tabled for discussion, and its proponents will be silenced as unserious. We can evaluate the success of neoliberal ideas in terms of this, by the degree to which they have framed what is possible over a period of more than 30 years. While it has never been possible to convince the majority of the population of the positive merits of key neoliberal policies, active assent is unnecessary. A sequence of neoliberal administrations throughout the world, in conjunction with a network of think tanks and a largely right-leaning media, have been able to transform the range of possible options to exclude even the most moderate of socialist measures. Projects concerning what we want our city to be are projects concerning human possibilities, who we want, or perhaps even more pertinently, who we do not want to become. Infrastructure such as suburbs in the United States was built with the explicit intention of isolating and individualizing existing solidarity networks and installing a gender division between the private and the public in the form of single-family households. Economic infrastructures also serve to modify and sculpt human behaviors. Indeed, technical infrastructures are often developed for political as well as economic purposes. In pre-Soviet Russia, there was remarkably widespread fascination with space exploration. Though aviation was still a novelty, the dreams of spaceflight promised total liberation from the signifiers of the past: social injustice, imperfection, gravity, and ultimately, the Earth. The utopian inclinations of the time made sense of the rapidly changing world, gave credence to the belief that humanity could channel history in a rational direction, and cultivated anticipations for a future society. In the more mystical formulations, cosmists argued with admirable ambition that workers at Lucas Aerospace came together to develop an alternative proposal for how to run the company and maintain jobs. Their basic argument was that, given the public funds being channeled into the corporation, society should have a say in, and benefit from, how these resources were being used. This was an argument that entailed channeling resources away from military armaments and into useful products. In order to develop the proposal for socially useful goods, the workers compiled a list of the skills and equipment available to them, took on the perspectives of planners, sought product suggestions from workers in their communities, and collectively decided how these technologies and skills could be repurposed to different ends. Rather than high-tech military equipment, the existing capacities were to be repurposed to design and produce medical technologies, renewable energy, safety improvements, and heating technology for social housing. The final plan ran to over 1,200 pages and included detailed proposals for 150 products. In order for it to achieve its political goals against an intransigent management, the strategy undertaken was in many ways a counter-hegemonic project, with workers explicitly aiming to inflame the imaginations of others and revise what people thought production was for. What may appear impossible today, there is often a significant untapped reservoir of potential lying dormant within a technology. Technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. Any given technology is political but flexible, as it always exists in excess of the purposes for which it may have been designed. Rather, the design, meaning, and impact of a technology are constantly shifting, altering as users transform it and as its environment changes. We can say that we know not what a socio-technical body can do. Who among us fully recognizes the untapped potentials of new discovery, the technologies that have already been developed? What sorts of post-capitalist communities could be built upon the material that we already have? Our wager is that the true transformative potentials of much of our technological and scientific research remains unexplored. Hegemonic politics is the antithesis to folk politics. It seeks to persuade and influence rather than presuming spontaneous politicization. It works on multiple scales rather than just a tangible and local. It sets out to achieve forms of social power that are long-lasting rather than temporary, and it operates in domains that are often not superficially political at all, rather than focusing on the most spectacular political mediums, such as street protests. The latest cycle of struggles has been exhausted, undone by their tendencies towards folk politics, and everywhere today, mass outrage combines with mass impotence. We have argued that the most promising way forward lies in reclaiming modernity and attacking the neoliberal common sense that conditions everything from the most esoteric policy discussions to the most vivid emotional states. This counter-hegemonic project can only be achieved by imagining better worlds. We have outlined one possible project, in the form of a post-work politics that frees us to create our own lives and communities. Triumph in the political battles to achieve it will require organizing a broadly populist left, building the organizational ecosystem necessary for a full-spectrum politics on multiple fronts, and leveraging key points of power whenever possible. While the carefully curated image of capitalism is one of dynamic risk-taking and technological innovation, this image in fact obscures the real sources of dynamism in the economy. Developments like railways, the internet, computing, supersonic flight, space travel, satellites, pharmaceuticals, voice recognition software, nanotechnology, touchscreens, and clean energy have all been nurtured and guided by states, not corporations. In other words, it has been collective investment, not private investment, that has been the primary driver of technological development. High-risk inventions and new technologies are too risky for private capitalists to invest in. Figures such as Steve Jobs and Elon Musk slyly obscure their parasitical reliance on state-led development. Likewise, multi-billion-dollar mega-scale projects are ultimately driven by non-economic goals that exceed any cost-benefit analysis. Projects of this scale and ambition are in fact hindered by market-based constraints, since a sober analysis of their viability in capitalist terms reveals them to be profoundly underwhelming. To unleash technological advancement, we must move beyond capitalism and liberate creativity from its current strictures. This would begin to liberate technologies away from their current purview of control and exploitation, and towards the quantitative and qualitative expansion of synthetic freedom. It would enable the utopian ambitions of mega projects to be unleashed, invoking the classic dreams of invention and discovery. The dreams of spaceflight, the decarbonization of the economy, the automation of mundane labor, the extension of human life, and so on, are all major technological projects that find themselves hampered in various ways by capitalism. The bootstrapping expansionary process of technology, once liberated from capitalist fetters, can potentiate both positive and negative freedoms. It can form the basis for a fully post-capitalist economy, enabling a shift away from scarcity, work, and exploitation, and towards the full development of humanity. This subject cannot be determined in advance. It can only be elaborated in the unfolding of practical and conceptual ramifications. There is no true essence to humanity that could be discovered beyond our enmeshments in technological, natural, and social webs. The idea that a post-work society would simply inculcate further mindless consumption neglects humanity's capacity for novelty and creativity, and invokes a pessimism based upon current capitalist subjectivity. The complexification of needs is disfigured under capitalist consumer society, to be sure, but, unbound from this mutation, their aim is necessarily the development of a rich individuality for the whole of mankind. The post-capitalist subject would therefore not reveal an authentic self that had been obscured by capitalist social relations, but would instead unveil the space to create new modes of being. As Marx noted, all history is nothing but a continuous transformation of human nature. It is first of all a practical matter to be carried out in time. Nevertheless, some general notions might be entertained. For Marx, the primary principle of post-capitalism was the development of human powers, which is an end in itself. Indeed, the fundamental aim of his project was universal emancipation. The various ideas that Marxists have advanced to get there, the socialization of production, ending the value form, eliminating wage labor, are simply means towards achieving this end. The immediate question is, what does this aim entail? The synthetic construction of freedom is the means by which human powers are to be developed.
Progression is as likely as progress.
The expansion of desires, of needs,
freedom and power
of
are
lifestyles,
intertwined.
of communities, of ways of being, of capacities, all are invoked by the project of universal emancipation. This is a project of opening up the future, of undertaking a labor that elaborates what it might mean to be human, of producing a utopian project for new desires, and of aligning a political project with the trajectory of an endless universalizing vector. Capitalism, for all its appearances of liberation and universality, has ultimately restrained these forces in an endless cycle of accumulation, ossifying the real potentials of humanity and constricting technological developments to a series of banal marginal innovations. We must expand our collective imagination beyond what capitalism allows. Rather than settling for marginal improvements in battery life and computer power, the left should mobilize dreams of decarbonizing the economy, space travel, robot economies, all the traditional touchstones of science fiction, in order to prepare for a day beyond capitalism. Neoliberalism, as secure as it may seem today, contains no guarantee of future survival. Any movement that wishes to remain relevant and politically potent must grapple with such potentials and developments in our technological world. Like every social system we have ever known, it will not last forever. Our task now is to invent what happens next.
We are all formally free. We are all formally free. We are all formally free. We are all formally free.
Infrastructure, which includes the means of communication and transport, is a significant component of the general conditions of production. If AI becomes a new electricity, it will be applied not only as an intensified form of workplace automation, but also as a basis for a deep and extensive infrastructural organization of the capitalist economy as such. Like electricity and telecommunications today, AI would be infrastructure, the means of cognition, presupposed by the production processes of any and all capitalist enterprises. It would be a general condition of production. Labor is a process between humans and nature, a process by which humans, through their own actions, mediate, regulate, and control the metabolism between themselves and nature.
Time does not pass. It is planned.
So let's take up speech and belief. That way we can calculate whether they come in contact with that which is not, or whether both are totally true and neither one is ever false.
Come on then, let's think about names again, in the same way we spoke about forms and letters of the alphabet. What we are looking for seems to lie in that direction.
What kind of question about them do we have to answer?
Whether all fit with each other, or none of them do, or some of them will and some of them won't.
Well, it's clear that some will and some won't. Names that signify something when you put them one after another fit together, and names that don't signify anything when you put them in a row don't fit.
Of course.
There are two ways to use your voice to indicate something about being. One way is called names, the other is called verbs.
Yeah?
A verb is the sort of indication that's applied to an action, and a name is the sort of spoken sign that's applied to things that perform the actions.
So no speech is formed just from names spoken in a row, and also not from verbs spoken without names.
Things like this don't make up speech.
Walks, runs, sleeps.
Or lion, stag, horse, and whatever other names there are of things that perform actions. A series like that wouldn't make up speech. Sounds uttered in the first way or in the second way don't indicate an action or an inaction, or the being of something that is or of something that is not. Not until we mix verbs with names. And when we do that, they fit together, and speech, the simplest and smallest kind of speech, arises from that first weaving of names and verbs together.
Human learns.
Yes.
And since he gives an indication about what is, or comes to be, or has come to be, and is going to be, he doesn't just name, but he accomplishes something by weaving verbs with names. And that's why we said he speaks and doesn't just name. This weaving is what we use the word speech for.
So some things fit together and some don't. Likewise, some vocal patterns fit together and some don't. And the ones that do produce speech.
Of course, yeah.
But there's still this small point.
What?
Whenever there's speech, it has to be about something. It's impossible for it not to be about something.
Yes?
And each part of speech has to have a particular quality.
Of course.
So let's look at ourselves.
All right.
I'll produce some speech by mixing a verb with a name, and you have to tell me what it's about.
I will.
Thea sits. It's not a long piece of speech, is it?
Not too long.
Your job is to tell me what it's about, what it's of.
Well, it's clearly about me and of me.
What about this one?
What one?
Thea works.
Well, no one would ever deny that it's of me and about me.
We also said that each piece of speech has to have a particular quality.
Yeah?
What quality would you say each of these has?
Well, the second one is false, I suppose, and the other one is true.
This is the final story about the relation of norms to nature, concepts to causes.
History can be naturalized, but nature cannot be historicized.
Confession,
If you don't mind, though,
forgiveness,
let's
and
think about
trust.
this.
What?
It seems that the nature of the different is chopped up, just like knowledge.
How?
Knowledge is a single thing, but each part of it that has to do with something is marked off and given a name peculiar to itself. Isn't it in the following way that the not beautiful comes to be?
Constructs a conception,
By being both
sense,
marked off within
that
the kinds of
purports to
those that
express
are,
the
and
objective
by being set over
concept,
against one another.
reference, articulating the content of the commitment, normative status,
So the being over
undertaken in the
against the
form of
being.
attitudes of belief and intention, so that the former are true and the
Not at
latter
all.
We
fulfilled.
have to say that the large and the not large.
The activity that is in this sense successfully forgiven is exhibited as the conceptualizing of the actual and the actualizing of the conceptual, infusing the normative into the natural so as to make what actually happens subject to normative assessment, and infusing the contingent into the necessary so as to make concepts determinately contentful. This sort of retrospective, reconstrual, and retroactive recontexting is reason's march through history.
Where did the future go? Where did the dreams of the future go? Take back control over our future and foster the ambition for a world more modern than capitalism.
We move faster. Capitalism demands it, yet we go nowhere. Instead, we must build a world in which we can accelerate out of our 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 accelerate accelerate out of our 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 stasis.